And so the exciting thing, if there is to be a silver lining here, is that we only need to go back 40 years in history to see that we didn't have this chronic disease epidemic going on. We don't have to go back to some paleo days or anything else. We just need to go back 40 years of human history to dial this earth back up to the point where it's producing, literally, Mother Earth producing the antidote to our most ridiculous mistakes and chemical horrors.
Welcome to the Wise Traditions podcast, sponsored by the Weston A. Price Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
I'm your host, Hilda Labrador. This is episode 113, and my guest is Dr. Zach Bush. Zach is one of the few triple board certified physicians in the country with expertise in internal medicine, endocrinology and metabolism, and hospice and palliative care. Zach has dedicated the last 8 years of his life working to reverse chronic disease with intense nutrition programs. Today, he gives insights from that journey. One key to good health is to look beyond food. We have to look at the soil. Zach talks about how soil has changed, how it in turn impacts our food, our gut, and our health. Before we get into the conversation, we want to recognize our sponsors. The Wise Traditions podcast is brought to you in part by the Weston A. Price Foundation. We have so many valuable health resources that we want to share with you. Beyond this podcast, we have a free booklet that we want to give you called The Principles of Healthy Diets. All you have to do is email us, info@westonaprice.org. Type the word booklet in the subject line, give us your address, and that's it. We'll ship one off to you right away. It contains fascinating information on Dr. Price, his work, dietary recommendations, and advice about what to do for optimal health. You're going to love it. And listeners like you, we appreciate your support of the show so much. Every donation, tweet, share, and like lets the world know that this content is valuable. So thanks for help spreading the show's reach. We are very grateful. Welcome to Wise Traditions, Zach.
Thank you so much for having me.
Zach, I want to kick things off by asking you about that aha moment you had when you were reading a scientific paper about soil, and you said it made you realize something about nutrition and health. Tell us about that moment.
So I was kind of full on into my deconstruction of my Western medicine training at that point. This was in 2012. I had left academic medicine in 2010 and started a nutrition clinic in Central Virginia in a food desert area here, one of the poorest counties in the state, and was working on reversing chronic disease with intense nutrition programs. And in that journey was finding that there was a significant number of my patients, 30 to 40%, that were not responding well to some of the healthiest foods on the planet. And so I was seeing superfoods making people more inflamed, not less inflamed. And so that started us down this journey of asking questions about, has the food fundamentally changed? And that ultimately led us down the pathway of, has the soil fundamentally changed? And so we pulled this paper. It's a white paper, 90-page expose on the intense science and biochemistry of soil. And I had never read a soil science paper before, and I'd read a lot about nutrition, but for some reason I never really looked past the plants into the soil for answers. And that's where that goosebump moment happened. On about page 40, there was a large carbon-backed molecule that looked a lot like the chemotherapy that I used to design at the University of Virginia. So I've come full circle through the journey of being a drug developer in the cancer environment. My background is in endocrinology and metabolism and internal medicine, also a hospice and palliative care. So done kind of the gamut clinically, and then my basic science was in the cancer. And I was working specifically on mitochondria, which are little guys that live inside our cells, and they signal and do cell-cell communication through their metabolites. And this goosebump moment that you speak of was the moment where we started to realize that the soil was doing something akin to those mitochondria inside our cells.
So suddenly it hit you that there might be a natural way to approach wellness without all the drugs, right?
Yeah, I was certainly fast on that slippery slope to realizing that perhaps health is more important than disease, and this was definitely a massive acceleration of that realization there.
So Zach, what did you do next?
I think I kind of slipped back into my drug mentality. I immediately thought, man, if we could grab that family of molecules and superdose that into my cancer patients, maybe we'd see dramatic results. So I went down that avenue for quite a while and eventually went to realize that it's not about superdosing, it's about getting this back into the diet of the gut and getting this back in touch with the microbiome and the ecosystem that lives in our gut to get the biggest impact. And so we dialed back into an oral therapy, taking a liquid version of that soil extract, and we saw just unbelievable results in the first few years of just watching people not impact the diseases we were expecting. They were absolutely just resetting their health baseline. We saw people resolving chronic inflammatory states that had been there for decades, affecting all kinds of different organ systems starting to correct as they got this soil communication back into the diet.
Can you tell us one of the stories of one of the patients who saw these improvements?
Yeah, there's innumerable of them really at this point. We've got a whole documentary built around this now that Dr. Joe Mercola put out last year. It's called Diet Against Disease. But a few of the stories that came out, you've got a 70-year-old patient who's been dealing with irritable bowel and just chronic constipation and diarrhea cycles for 4 or 5 decades of her life. And then we were actually helping her with her diabetes and doing intense nutrition regimen. She was making slow progress, but her gut was getting worse, not better. She was having more bloating. She was having more issues despite all of the fiber and the kale and everything else we were feeding her. Then she started just this soil extract, and within days, 3 days, 4 days in, she's having the best bowel movements she's had in 4 or 5 decades. And she starts to experience kind of this youthifying effect where she has better concentration. She starts having the best sleep quality she's had in decades. She actually moves into a more active state in her retirement community, joining groups and starting to get engaged socially again. Just really a reset at this fundamental foundational level of the gut, the nutrition, how our environment is trying to fuel the body.
And this was a 70-year-old woman?
Yeah, she was 76 at the time, and now she's in her early 80s and doing well still. And it starts to beg the question is, do we really know what human lifespan should look like? Do we know what the human aging or the lack of aging look like if we were really in touch with a healthy ecosystem?
I've heard people say that the gut is a second brain, but recently I heard Natasha Campbell McBride speak, and she said the gut is the first brain. What do you think of that, Zach?
I 100% agree with that. The number keeps going up as to the amount of neurotransmitter we produce in the gut. Right now, the current estimates are that 90% of the serotonin produced in the body is produced in the gut, not the brain. And so you start to see 90% of those neurotransmitters that are going to go on to help prevent depression, improve sleep quality, improve pleasure pathways, all of these things is pretty spectacular testimony to the power of the gut when it's in a healthy state.
Well, so what makes the gut be in an unhealthy state? What are the things that are like attacking it and messing it up?
It's a great question. It's interesting. We're a clear 10 years into this journey, even in Western medicine, where we're starting to acknowledge that every disease out there is based somehow in a root cause event that happens in the gut. And yet, despite all of this attention and research and everything else, it's very difficult to find a concise definition of what gut health looks like. You can read ad nauseum about all of these gut diseases, but to find a definition of gut health is very poorly defined, and it's a bit of a tragedy for the direction of medicine that we're not spending more effort on defining the attributes of a healthy gut. So I'll do that for you today. Step one is certainly a diverse ecosystem. And so we are so profoundly outnumbered by the microorganisms that live in and around our bodies. And they have this profound effect on our genetics and on our metabolism, the way in which we store fuel, the way in which we burn fuel, the ways in which our brain works, et cetera, et cetera. This microbiome is nigh on to something like the Great Barrier Reef or the jungles of Costa Rica in its biodiversity. We should have somewhere between 30 and 40,000 bacterial species. We should have somewhere around 5 million fungal species in the fungi in and around us. And so it's just this massive teeming environment. We even have parasites that are very important for human health that live in our skin pores and under our eyelids and in our gut. And so we've got all of these incredible species that support this biologic life that we call human.
Beautiful picture. I'm thinking of a phrase I've heard some people say, nature abhors a monoculture, right? There's such diversity out there, and somehow our guts have become monocultures. But you're going to get into that. First, keep describing this healthy gut for us.
The next step after that is then the intelligence of the gut barrier system. The gut barrier is a complex system of proteins that more or less look like Velcro. They attach one cell to the next cell into a coherent barrier separating your immune system from the outside world. And it's the largest membrane in the whole body. The gut membrane starts at your sinuses, runs down through your posterior pharynx there of your airway, down into the esophagus, stomach, small intestine, colon, to the rectum. That whole surface area of that system covers 2 tennis courts. This is obviously vastly larger than the mere 1.5 square meters of skin that your surface area that you have. So hugest exposure you have to the environment is this gut lining, and interesting in its engineering in that it's only 1 cell layer thick. Your skin has anywhere from 25 to 100 layers of skin cells stacked up on top of each other to create that durable barrier. The gut, though, only has 1 cell layer, which is about 50 microns in depth, which is about half the width of a human hair. So you pluck a hair, imagine slicing that in half, and then that's your entire barrier. That's your entire front line of defense from the outside world. And it's the integrity of that lining that perhaps is certainly, if not the first, then certainly the second most important thing when we go to define gut health. That barrier system is challenged and broken apart by a lot of common stuff in our environment. And certainly the most ubiquitous or common things that you're going to see in your diet now are the herbicides and pesticides, the weed killers and the bug killers. The most abundant of these is certainly Roundup or glyphosate, glyphosate being the active ingredient in Roundup. And it came off of patent in 2007, and so now all 5 major chemical companies in the U.S. make glyphosate, and China actually exports the vast majority of glyphosate to the agricultural environment globally. But we've seen the amount of Roundup and glyphosate doubling every 6 years for the last 30 or so.
Wait. Did you say doubling?
Doubling every 6 years.
Every 6 years.
And so currently that puts us at about 4.5 billion pounds of glyphosate on the planet annually. The stunning fact of that single chemical is that it's never been patented as a weed killer, even though that's its purported use. It's been patented most often as an antibiotic, antifungal, antiparasite. It kills all of these single-celled organisms that we live around. And so it's certainly the most ubiquitous antibiotic on the planet, and it's killing the biodiversity that we so depend on. And as the biodiversity dies in the soil and in our gut from constant exposure to this chemical that's now in our food, it's in our water, it's even unfortunately being a water-soluble toxin now in 75% of our rainfall, 75% of the air we breathe. It is a truly ubiquitous chemical. And it has a double-fold injury on this intelligence or health of the gut. Number one, functioning as an antibiotic, it wipes out that biodiversity. But number two, it has a direct effect on breaking apart the tight junctions or the Velcro between those cells that would constitute that frontline barrier. And so in one fell swoop, we created a chemical that would wipe out the bacterial detox and cleanup force that we have in our gut. And then we would, in the same chemical, destroy the gut lining, creating a permeable environment where suddenly we're all becoming sensitive to everything we breathe, everything we eat. So it's food sensitivities, food allergies, environmental allergies, seasonal allergies, mold allergies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Zach, what would you say to the person who's like, oh, all this talk about toxins in the air and glyphosate, like it's just alarmist? What would you say to them?
Well, it depends on what your goals are for the humanity. If your goals are to see us decline and disappear in number or perhaps off the face of the planet, then we're right on target. If your goals are for us to survive, then we should be alarmist. We currently have an unimaginable epidemic of chronic disease happening in this country that is not getting talked about politically, let alone at the important EPA, USDA, and FDA levels, not to mention the CDC. We just are not getting a robust discussion on the fact that we've gone from 1 in 9, 1 in 10 adults with cancer to 1 in 2 males now with cancer over the last 40 years. We've gone from 1 in 5,000 children to 1 in 40 children with autism. We've had a tripling of Parkinson's in males in the last 20 years. We've had a tripling of Alzheimer's in the last 30 years in women. We have an extraordinary amount of chronic disease in our population now. Look at our children, for example. In the 1960s, the entire population from cradle to grave in the United States had a chronic disease burden of about 4 to 6%. Now, our children alone have a chronic disease burden of 46%. And so we've had this massive increase in chronic disease, it's actually hard to find a kid that isn't on a medication by the time they're in college. And of course, the systems that are getting most destroyed are the gut and the neurologic systems of these children.
It's common sense when I look around kids on a playground or I talk to parents, they're like, oh yeah, this kid has the ADD and the other one struggles with this or is on the spectrum. So you're right. All we have to do is open our eyes. The question I have is, why isn't this conversation being had at those high levels as you discussed?
Wow, that definitely opens up a Pandora's box. I could throw out a bunch of philosophy and theories as to why I think that that's the case, but I think the safest one to just conclude with without taking up the rest of your time is simply money. It's an incredible business to produce food on the planet. And we have one company now, Monsanto, that owns 90% of the staple crops in the United States. That's an extraordinary market monopoly. And that company is owned by the pharmaceutical industry. And the pharmaceutical industry makes 5 to 10 times more than that agricultural system, treating the diseases that come from a poor diet. And so in the end, it's a perfect business model. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's just good business to subtract out the nutrition and nutrients in our plants that would be our medicinals and then create a pharmaceutical industry behind that to treat the diseases that then crop up.
And then they're going to lobby to protect those interests at the government level, right?
With a lot of money. You got Monsanto's $66 billion sale to Bayer, the largest pharmaceutical company on the planet now. So you've got these massive mega billion-dollar industries that can dump an extraordinary amount of money into lobbying at the FDA, at the USDA, at the CDC. We just have so much private interest influence on our legislative decisions and on our regulatory bodies that are supposed to be protecting us are literally being run by the companies that create the toxins in our environment.
When we come back, we'll hear about how to prevent our gut lining from becoming porous and how to rebuild that critical gut barrier. We want to pause now and thank our sponsors, the Weston A. Price Foundation. Do you want to learn more about the work of Dr. Price? Are you curious about the traditional people groups that he has studied? Would you like to know what foods the healthiest people ate and how they prepared them? These questions are all answered in a booklet that we have available for free for you. The booklet is called Principles of Healthy Diets, and you can get it by simply emailing the foundation at info@westonaprice.org. Put the word booklet in the subject line and we'll ship it out to you right away at no cost. And listeners like you. Oxyphos had this to say on Apple Podcasts. Anyone in pursuit of better health should tune in. Thanks so much. We feel the same way. And if you do too, go ahead and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts so you can help get the word out. The more reviews we have, the more people can see the value added that comes from this show. And thanks ahead of time. Okay, so the big picture is very challenging and may take some time to correct itself. So let's go back to the little picture of our own health. How do we protect and prevent this glyphosate from making our guts so porous?
Yeah, and this is the excitement, is that, this discovery in 2012 that we opened the conversation with is simply a family of molecules that are made by bacteria and fungi in the healthy soil and in the healthy human intestine. And that huge family of molecules, we had no idea what we had stumbled into when we first started studying these. But in the end, we've found that these are functioning as a real antidote to that glyphosate chemical at the gut lining. We can show incredible barrier repair and protection if you've got this robust covering of these carbon molecules along the gut lining before you hit the Roundup with it. And we've done this thousands of times with kind of dietary levels of glyphosate, but we've even taken the glyphosate Roundup doses to 20,000 times that what you would see in your diet, and we continue to see incredible protective quality to this family of molecules made in healthy soil. And so the exciting thing, if there is to be a silver lining here, is that we only need to go back 40 years in history to see that we didn't have this chronic disease epidemic going on. We don't have to go back to some paleo days or anything else. We just need to go back 40 years of human history to dial this earth back up to the point where it's producing, literally, Mother Earth producing the antidote to our most ridiculous mistakes and chemical horrors.
Do you see some soil that is being regenerated?
Absolutely. There's a lot of people now working on this. Huge fan of biodynamic farming. It's where we definitely need to go beyond organic. We need to really start thinking energetically in this microbiome environment about our soil systems It's not enough just to pour less toxin in. We really need to heal the soil at a deep level and participate in that ecosystem recovery. And so I celebrate every biodynamic farmer out there. I celebrate every organic farmer out there that are definitely going in the right direction. And so that's an exciting thing. But we're starting to see the youth really mobilized. Perhaps you're familiar with the nonprofit coming out of Venice, California. It's called Kiss the Ground. And what an incredible group of young people there, really motivated, brilliant thought leaders and social media gurus who are getting the message out that as young generations, we need to reverse the pattern that our older generations have handed to us. This consumptive process, the consumptive technology, the consumptive food chain of the planet's most precious resources, mostly being soil and fresh water. Kiss the Ground's real hope. And, there's been a bunch of documentaries in the last 2 years that we've participated in that are getting this word out there to youth and the adult population alike. So I'm encouraged because of the sudden burden of disease that we're seeing, because every single family now has somebody sick. It's getting to the point where everybody's beginning to ask the tough questions, and it's podcasts and radio shows like the ones I do every week, and this one here that you're doing right now that give me the greatest hope is, as a doctor, there's only so much I can impact with seeing one patient at a time. But with VoiceBox, with 1,000 podcasts, we can have a public health revolution in short order if we get the right message into the consumer's hands.
It is exciting, and I'm grateful for the group you mentioned. I also think of the Savory Institute, right? They're all about beyond organic, regenerative work for the soil. So let's get back to what is attacking. You mentioned glyphosate. I also just want to bring up briefly gluten, because again, when I was talking to Dr. Natasha Campbell-McBride recently, she said that gluten is difficult for everybody to digest. Does that also kind of poke holes in our gut lining?
It can, yes. It does this through a very specific pathway. It turns out that we really did not have gluten sensitivity until the 1990s. There was, a very scarce, maybe 1 in 100,000, 1 in a million that were having gluten sensitivity before that moment. Our group has actually just uncovered one of the mechanisms by which we've caused the gluten sensitivity event where we suddenly are all prone to that injury. And it's coming down to the mechanism of, again, Roundup. And so it turns out that in 1992, we started adding Roundup to our wheat as a desiccant or drying agent. We would spray all the wheat field right before we would harvest it to kill it prematurely so it would dry quickly in the northern climates especially. And so with that advent of gluten and glyphosate in the same bite of food, our group has now shown the phenomenon in a couple of different mechanisms. So we published a paper 2 years ago on the synergy between gluten and glyphosate, and now we've got one coming out this year in 2018 that's showing the exact mechanism by which glyphosate increases the toxicity of the gluten to that gut lining. And in a nutshell, I won't go into the complicated science terms and everything else because it's a bunch of unnamed receptors, but one of them is CXCR3 is the main one. So this receptor is expressed on the surface of the small intestine and colon, but it's scarcely present in a healthy human gut. But as soon as you add Roundup to the diet, you see CXCR3 receptors starting to express widely across the entire gut membrane. And so now when you eat gluten, the whole gut membrane will bind gliadin, which is a breakdown product of the gluten, and trigger this opening of all the tight junctions and turn your gut into a leaky sieve there.
So it's not like people are just saying that they're gluten intolerant because it's a trend. Some people are very dismissive about it, like, oh, brother. But it truly is this synergy or this gluten and glyphosate pairing up together that are making our gut lining more dysfunctional.
It's a biochemical injury that's happened through our farming industry, and it's really difficult to avoid. Excitingly, though, in the same way that we've shown that the bacteria and fungi produce communication network that would prevent the Roundup injury, we see that trickle-down effect where we also prevent that gluten injury and can repair that gluten injury much quicker if the bacteria and fungi are present and producing a lot of this carbon substrate.
So for the listener who's listening right now and is like, okay, I'm convinced, I really want to heal my gut, I understand that I need to do that so that I can have that healthy gut Zach was describing earlier. What should they do? Like, we can eat the best foods from the best soil, but clearly something needs to rebuild that gut barrier, right?
There's a number of things we do in our clinic to begin that process. Number one is really becoming aware of the injury itself. And so making sure you're doing everything you can to eat as organic as you can, get as many of the herbicides and pesticides out of your environment possible. This needs to pull attention to your water system. If you live in Southern California or in the Midwest or any high agricultural environment, you're going to want to make sure you're either reverse osmosis treating your water or you're getting bottled water from elsewhere, because the water systems are just so contaminated, especially down as once you hit the southern parts of the United States in the Mississippi, Louisiana area. So we really have created a Holocaust type environment, I believe, down there in the deep South from the amount of Roundup that comes down the Mississippi. And so depending on where you live, turn your attention to your water. Make sure you're drinking clean water. That's going to start allowing your gut to recover as you take the antibiotic pressure off of it. Step 2 then is really getting back into nature as much as possible. What you're trying to do is really expose your nasosinuses in your gut to microflora that you don't usually breathe in a day. And so I really encourage my patients to get into new ecosystems. In Virginia here, we're pretty fortunate. I can send them up to the Appalachian Trail one weekend. They can spend time with ancient flora and fauna along the Appalachian Trail, the waterfalls, everything else, huge beds of ferns that are prehistoric. So we can get back into some really ancient ecosystems there and then send them out to the beach the following weekend and spend a couple days in that environment, then down to the swamps in Southern Virginia. So depending on which state you live, I'd encourage you to start exploring what different ecosystems can you find. And we're just very blessed here in the United States with extraordinary diversity of climate and ecosystem to tap into. So travel broadly and explore nature at its depth. Spend time camping, spend time cycling or hiking outside. Breathe as much microenvironment as you can. Next step is very close to home, and that's just as simple as stepping outside. Get your shoes off and get your bare feet in the soil at least a few days a week, and spend some time weeding a garden or cleaning up a path or a sidewalk near your home. Get down where your face is close to the soil and you're interacting with that soil. You're pulling weeds out where there's a burst of microflora that go into the air as you yank a weed out of the ground. Be a part of that agricultural system locally. If you don't have a garden, if it's difficult for you to get outside, then simply grow a plant in your window. The simple thing of interacting with a piece of soil and a plant system is really powerful at helping move this microbiome forward. Finally, then, I'm a huge fan of all the fermented foods. And so you want a wild fermentation. Most of the sauerkrauts and stuff historically have been just made by one strain of bacteria. And so you're not getting that multicultural environment, and you're lacking the potential of that sauerkraut or whatever you're eating. So in contrast, you want to have a wild ferment going, and the wild ferment would include sauerkraut, sour Reuben, kimchi. Beets are a huge favorite of mine. Fermented beets with dill are phenomenal. So think about getting at least a tablespoon or two of fermented food into 2 or 3 of your meals a day to augment that microbiome in your environment. Finally, then, we can turn our attention to that soil environment. We've been extracting a very ancient family of these carbon molecules from the fossil layer of soil that's about 50 million years old and seeing pretty extraordinary results. You know, the sad reality is on planet Earth right now, you're lucky to find 1 or 2 feet of topsoil, and most of the topsoil is only a few inches deep because of the decimation we've had on the microbiome and the ecosystem at large. But 50 million years ago, we had extremely deep soil levels that were growing plants that were more nutrient dense and larger than anything that grows on Earth now. And so we've had fun extracting these through a water process and tapping into this ancient wisdom of the soils of Earth before humans hit. And that's been a really incredible process to see the restorative effect of that.
And those microbes are the ones that you put in that Restore product, is that right?
Yeah, the Restore is the product. It's sterile. It's important to realize there's no bacteria in there. All we're extracting is the communication network from the bacteria and fungi from that dense ecosystem that lived 50 million years ago. And so this is perhaps the first supplement on the market that's not trying to do anything. It's not trying to micromanage your gut. It's not trying to be a probiotic where you're adding 3 species and creating these monocultures with probiotics. Instead, it's backing off on the management side and increasing the communication network. And so we're really working to provide a diverse communication network between the bacteria and the fungi and the human system itself. And that's where we see restoration of the microbiome in the gut, as well as restoration of that Velcro-like system, the tight junctions that we've been talking about.
Zach, this is so fascinating. I hope we can have you on again because I know there's a lot more to dive into. I think I have to wrap up now, though, and I want to end with a question that you may have answered, but if you haven't, or if you want to take a different tack on it, that's great. The question is this: if the listener could only do one thing to improve their health, what would you recommend that they do?
Get outside. It's as simple as changing up your daily rhythm. If you wake up in the same drywall box every day that you call a home, and then you get into a garage and get into a car and you drive to another box that you call your office, and then you reverse that in the evening, and maybe you stop by a large box that's called a grocery store, start to realize that, man, you are so isolated from the nature that you were really developed in over tens of thousands of years, and really think about diving back out into that nature in a new and more aggressive fashion to get back in touch with health.
Excellent advice. We are going to go for it, even though it's cold in the month of January. So thank you so much for your time today, Zach. We hope to talk to you again.
Pleasure to be on, Hilda. Thanks for your time.
My guest today was Dr. Zach Bush. For more from Zach, go to his website, zachbushmd.com. For an overview of today's discussion and links to resources we mentioned, go to westonprice.org, click on the tab for blogs and podcasts, and find the show notes for episode 113. Hey, and a big shout out to my friends at Podcast Village. Charlie Burney and his team are so good at what they do. They are pros when it comes to training, producing, and promoting podcasts. Check them out at podcastvillage.com. Special thanks to editor and producer Rob Ford and the team of interns for the show: Cynthia Castro, Cohen Enriquez, Joy de los Santos, Elisa Canty, and Lily Hemft. Thanks also to Amy Marvin for her help transcribing episodes. Hey, and if you liked what you heard today, or even if you didn't, just let us know. You can email us at podcast@westonprice.org and give us your feedback. Or look for me personally at Holistic Hilda on Twitter, at Holistic_Hilda on Instagram. I would love to connect with you and get your feedback on this show or anything pertaining to health and wellness. Thanks so much, and keep listening, everybody.
Have you been enjoying these podcasts? Have you benefited from them or from the resources on the website or local chapter meetings? If so, please become a member of the Weston A. Price Foundation. It's only $25 for students and seniors and $40 for a general membership. Your contribution is critical for the continued work of the foundation. Wise Traditions is brought to you by the Weston A. Price Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. The content of this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for medical advice.